Professor Hansen is the Reliance Dhirubhai Ambani Professor in South Asian Studies and Professor in Anthropology at Stanford. Professor Hansen is also Director of Stanford Center for South Asia. Very good morning to you.
Morning.
I have a few questions for you today, sir. Firstly, what do you think about the media trial and hunting of Umar Khalid?
Well, a couple of things. One is that the media, one thing that's become very clear is that the electronic media, especially in India these days, is a completely different beast, a different entity from what we have been used to, how we've been used to think about the media, the sort of partisanship, especially the CTV, but other channels as well, is something that needs attention. We may need to rethink how we think of media and even the public sphere, how that works in India today, and how that is completely part of a sort of, or willing to buy into a particular government agenda. And there's a certain stampede effect, I think, that nobody wants to actually criticize the government on this issue, none of the major outlets. So I think that's quite shocking and bad news for civil liberties and the role of the press, that role that the press have had in India for many years. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I'm in a way not surprised that Umar Khalid now is becoming the main target. And let me put it in a very brutal way, that the reason is that there's been a lot of support for Kanya Kumar and the way he was picked up and arrested, and it's much less easy, it's more difficult to see how a similar configuration of forces will support Umar Khalid. And I think the Indian state, and this is not just about the BJP, the Indian state has for a long time learned the lesson, and the BJP represents this in a sort of extreme version, that you can target and do more or less what you want with Muslims because nobody's going to stand up for them. If you do that if you imagine that Kanya Kumar had been a upper middle class boy from Delhi, I am sure none of what would have happened. Now people have found out he's a boy from a economically depressed background. He's in a sense potentially the poster boy of New India. We don't want to go after him. I think Umar Khalid is a much better target. So I think all these calculations are going in there, and it's easy to pinpoint and say this is BJP and all that, but I think it's important that we remind ourselves that this is how the state apparatus has worked and moved in that direction for a long time. Don't forget that Yaqub Menon was actually executed under the previous government and on very flimsy grounds. Mm-hmm. He may have been guilty, I don't know, but you don't execute people when there's such big question marks.
Mm-hmm. On the same lines, do you think that the JNU president, Kanhaiya Kumar, should have been arrested?
No. I think it's outrageous. I mean, it's outrageous in any case, in any country, to arrest people, student leaders, student activists for whatever protests they're doing, and especially on charges of sedition. There is nothing seditious about this. Mm-hmm. I think the BJP would love to have the entire opposition, in a sense, put on notice that sedition is a sword that hangs over you, and it's very interesting that the same legal provision, the colonial legal provision that was used to try and put behind bars many of the nationalist leaders are now being turned against people who are critical of this government. That's a new step. I think it's a step that has really outed, as it were, the BJP government and shown it for what it is. A government that has no respect for civil liberties, that has a strongly authoritarian bent. I have worked for many years on this particular movement, so I'm not surprised by any of these actions. I think they would have loved to do it earlier. And it was almost like a predictable thing that there would be a clash at some point between the BJP government and what you could call the liberal intelligentsia. And JNU is, of course, seen as the sort of fortress of that particular sentiment in India. They chose this particular moment to take that fight. I think they thought they would have an easy ride because of the issue of Kashmir, which supposedly is something that unites both left and right in India. We can talk more about that. I think there are many scandals buried in this whole supposed consensus around Kashmir. But you don't arrest a student activist on charges of sedition when all that was happening was shouting of some slogans.
Sure.
So it's like overkill and overreach if there ever was one.
Do you see a link between the death of Rohith Vemula and the incidences at JNU? Do you think that the government is using one to cover up the other at this point in time?
Well, I find that in the aftermath of the death of Vemula, I mean, yes, the government didn't have a good response. As a whole, I find the BJP government being completely unable to handle questions of caste, and especially lower caste and Dalit issues. We saw it in the electoral scene in Bihar. They cannot handle it. They don't actually have. They say they're pro-Dalit, but of course we know that the movement as a whole is not. They don't know how to handle this. They don't know how to handle and have a good line on the sort of structural violence that's built into the caste system, that's acted out and is lived and experienced through many people who belong to lower caste, and especially Dalits, as they are in educational institutions or in their workplaces or whatever, or their careers are made very difficult. But it's not just the BJP. I mean, it's what it showed was a much wider array of a sort of form of denial of this problem among many of the privileged in India today, sort of closing your eyes. We don't want to. It's like what the US may have been in the 1950s, where people would say we don't have a race problem. It's an individual case. At least the US has moved towards acknowledging there's a race problem. Doesn't mean racism has gone. I think India still has to acknowledge that caste is a real problem, and it's a real form of everyday violence. And most people, not just in the BJP, but many people have not accepted this. So yes, you can say, are they covering this up? Yes, because anything connected to Kashmir seems to be that shared sentiment that they hope they can bank on.
Yeah.
This is, by the way, what the BJP always does when you are in trouble: reach for the Muslim enemy.
Yeah.
And that's the only, if I may say so, the only trick they have.
Yeah. Do you think that the state over the past few years has been using violence a lot to quash a lot of this dissent that's been coming up?
They have. They've been using the various organs of the state more brutally and more overtly to persecute and go after their detractors and critics.
Yeah.
But some of the violence, like some of the murders and the beef affair in Dadri and all that, was not done by the state. So some of the violence is also perpetrated by other groups, but the law enforcement is not doing anything. And we saw this in the Delhi courthouse, right?
Yeah.
The police stood by while the rogue lawyers were beating up. So this is also how I think the Indian state functions. But let me say that some of that crushing of dissent is not just the doing of the BJP. It's the state apparatus has developed a lot of different repressive functions. And if you look at if you live in the Northeast or you live in Kashmir or any of these areas, the Indian state doesn't appear as anything but a very repressive state that crosses dissent. And I think a lot of people in mainstream India are simply unaware of this and sees the state as something that should be a more benevolent institution. And if you belong to the privileged sectors of society, you only see the benevolence of the state. You see it as a slightly inept bureaucratic machine. Yeah. But if you belong to a more marginal community, the state is not your friend. The state is a brutal entity.
Moving now to educational institutions, what do you think about the institutional maligning of JNU? And JNU is one of India's best universities for the social sciences.
Yeah, so I mean, as I said before, I think this is a conflict that's been coming, almost inevitable.
Yeah.
See, the problem for the BJP and the Hindu right is that they don't have an intellectual cadre of their own.
Yeah.
They never had, and they don't have one now. They have some people switching sides because it's convenient, and that I don't have to mention any names, but there are a number of people doing this. But as a whole, they don't have an intellectual cadre. They don't have the support of the overwhelming majority of people who have higher education or are students or faculty or whatever. Academics in India as a whole are not with the BJP. So they see themselves against a certain kind of liberal, left-leaning establishment, and they know it's one of their Achilles' heels.
Yeah.
So it's almost written into it that conflict had to happen, and I think they're trying to mobilize a form of anti-intellectualism that you also is very well known in this country, for instance, among the Republicans specifically, but also other quarters. It's very easy to portray students and academics as sort of undeserving, privileged people who are cut off from reality, and it's a way of in a sense saying that they don't really belong to the real people. They don't have real experiences. They have no right to speak about anything. So this may have some political purchase, but it's a gamble. I think they're playing up the sentiment in a strange kind of way, arguing that the majority is being endangered by this small majority, minority of educated people or students or academics.
Yeah.
That they're enemies of India, they're anti-national, and so on and so forth. So I think that's been in the works for some time. It's just coming up now. If it hadn't come up now, my prediction would have been it would come up next year.
Sure. And finally, what do you think that the impact of this entire situation that has arisen in JNU and HCU will be on civil liberties in India as a whole?
Well, I think India needs to have a real conversation about civil liberties. There hasn't been one, not even after the lifting of the emergency in the 1970s. And I think civil liberties are not doing well in India. People congratulate themselves on how well Indian democracy is doing at the electoral, in terms of the electoral dynamics, which is true. But civil liberties, that is the genuine respect for opposition, for dissenters and people you disagree with should be allowed to speak and enjoy their freedoms. That's not a public sentiment, and it's not a public sentiment that's been promoted by the state. Quite on the contrary, the state in India still is based on the colonial frame of a suspicious, somewhat paranoid entity that's afraid of the public. So civil liberties have to be based on a respect for the public, and that respect doesn't exist. And there's a lot of people in India who feel that there are too many liberties in India, that democracy should be curbed somewhat. And many of them have voted for the BJP, but there are also many people who have that sentiment also you find in other parts of the population. So I think India has produced a very vibrant democracy, but it's not a democracy that has produced a strong commitment to civil liberty as a principle. And maybe this is a good time to begin that conversation.
Thank you so much, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the day.
You too. Thanks.